Hello, everyone. I'm Dan. Welcome to my tools talk. I'm a level designer and a tools designer at Grinding Gear Games, and if you've seen my previous NZGDC talks, you know that I try and acquire a new title every time I give one, just to really confuse the event staff. At Grinding Gear Games, we work on Path of Exile. You may know it. It's a free-to-play action RPG that was officially launched in 2013. Then in 2019, we showed the first footage of Path of Exile 2, an epic new adventure in the world of Wraeclast and our most ambitious project to date. Since then, we've been hard at work on both, and I've been helping to provide our developers with powerful tools to build them both quickly and easily. So what kind of challenges do we face? Well, let me set the scene. Path of Exile runs on a custom-built in-house engine and heavily relies on procedural content generation. We use modular tiles, scripts, and props to build complex environments, then populate them with vicious monsters and valuable loot. These are all complex systems that require purpose-built tools that we've had to design and maintain and build alongside an evolving code and content base. For example, we need tools to take these basic assets and tell the game how to interpret them. How do those tiles connect to one another? Can those lights turn on and off? If someone tries to walk through that pillar, what stops them? A full tile and doodad set might have hundreds of individual assets. How many work hours will it take to make metadata for all of them? Once our assets are set up, we need a second tool that lets us build an actual level out of them. Path of Exile isn't completely procedurally generated. It involves a lot of handcrafted building blocks, which we call rooms. Now, sometimes we mean that literally. This is a physical room that the player can enter and exit, but a room could also be a field with a tree in it. And these rooms need information telling the game how to use them and what to put in them. But a level isn't just a bunch of rooms jammed together. We need another tool to define layouts, one that takes the complexity of a procedural space and breaks it down into a series of nodes and edges. A node is a landmark, and an edge is either a series of tiles or rooms that join those landmarks together. We can then tell Path of Exile's terrain generation system in a broad sense how to use each element. And that gives us the finished level. You can see the entrance and exit on either side and a randomly selected assortment of rooms building our dungeon between them. We need another set of tools for this as well, because although we can see our final levels in game, we need to be able to rapidly preview and iterate through level layouts for design and debugging. So that workflow is directly supported by a toolset. I might mark up our series of tiles in the asset viewer. I then take those assets into our room editor and assemble them into a scene, then use the graph editor to tell the scene where in my level to spawn. Then I would preview several different random generations of that level using the tile test bed. So that's 4 tools already, and I haven't even gone into our game data editor to make the level available in game, or the custom plugins that our environment artists use in Maya. We have many more tools, both first and third party, used by different departments in different workflows. Let's call them our studio's development infrastructure. The goal of the infrastructure is to make each developer's workflow as effortless as possible. They should be able to pick the tools they need, build what they need, and move on as smoothly as possible. If they run into a limitation or a problem with the tools, the tool development team should be able to quickly either solve it or redirect their efforts. So how do you do that? In a working studio, you're always going to face time and resource constraints. But even so, it's worth pursuing the following goals: discoverability. Tools are iterated on over time, typically gaining features mid-development while everybody is busy. Is information about them easy to access? How about for a first-time user? Ergonomics, new features are likely built functionality first before the most efficient workflow has been figured out. How can you polish and redesign those features in order to make them easier for your developers to use? Functionality, tools require maintenance. Technical changes that are made for the good of the game might erode the functionality of the tools. How can you it's very worth being wary of that buildup of inefficiency over time. And responsiveness. Even the most well-considered improvement to the tools is less useful if it comes too late in development. Listening to the current needs of the development team and prioritizing accordingly is key. So trying to achieve all of these during regular development is hard enough, but Path of Exile 2 demands more of us. It's straining the infrastructure that we already had. Improving ergonomics and discoverability are both important when training new staff, and having the tools be highly functional and responsive is a boon to experienced developers, especially ones who are working on new features and techniques. We face challenges on all of these fronts in level design, so it was agreed that we should make tools development a priority. As 2020 came to a close, I, along with 2 of our programmers, set about improving our level design tools. For the ones used by other departments, we'd just focus on improving our parts at first, and I was confident that I understood the level design workflow and its points of friction enough to draw up improvement plans for the stuff that was ours. In my estimation, the tool that could make the most improvement was the room editor. It's our equivalent of something like an Unreal editor. It's our bread and butter content creation tool, and we had a lot to gain in terms of both accessibility and ergonomics. For a bit of context, when we made the Fall of Oriath expansion in 2017, it looked like this. So it's a simple, functional tool that had carried us through over a decade of Path of Exile development. The only thing was, it wasn't so simple anymore. For years, programmers had been adding complex and powerful features to it, and that old UI hadn't been capable of supporting them except via hotkeys. So essentially, we're using a toolkit where half the tools are invisible, and we didn't really know how many we always had. And that old UI didn't limit us with just adding new features. That content palettes at the top left up there, those aren't actually menus or anything. They just populate the screen with a bunch of radio buttons that correspond to asset folders. And that was before we discovered extra features, we'll call them. So by bypassing some of the automatic checks and balances of the room editor, us level designers could create elaborate multi-room structures with a few manual file tweaks and a text editor. But they would break if anybody else tried to export them. So this up here is the Crimson Township map that we introduced last year. The layout is almost half unexportable rooms that I created using this method. Now, the level itself is perfectly valid for the game, but I've essentially made a series of traps for any future level designers that want to come and edit it. Now, we had already recognized our UI's limitations. We'd begun converting over the old UI to the Dear IamGUI library, which was a process that was still incomplete in the more specialized tools after several years. So you can see the radio buttons that I mentioned there. At this point, they've still essentially blocked out any of the actual content that you would normally be accessing. And then on the right is the partial conversion that we did over to the new library. So you can see we've kind of recreated the menu from the previous version of it with a couple of extra checkboxes and stuff, but it's not really gone that much more advanced. Meanwhile, the old UI's font had also been broken by a necessary engine update, and that made it very difficult to read. It hadn't been fixed because we were planning to replace it entirely, and this was a plan that we were very eager to put into action. So, with our core content creation tool threatening to render itself unusable, we finally set out to begin the overhaul based on concept images I'd drawn up in late 2018. At this time, I wasn't really familiar with the IamGUI library, but I knew what would make my life easier. So not just cleaning up the UI, but establishing usability standards while we were there. So my goal was that any changes should enhance the level design workflow while disrupting it as little as possible. But I'm not formally trained in UI or UX design, so I needed to do a lot of research and solicit a lot of feedback throughout this process. And having these basic standards made for a good starting point. So my basic discoverability standard was that I wanted every feature that the tool could do to be visible. That way you at least knew what you could do. And context was something that I wanted for pretty much all of the files that we were using as well. I was always wanting to track them down, open them, edit them, and something else. So we ended up developing a whole set of standard file functions that we use throughout. We also deal with a lot of categories and lists, especially in such a mature game, which means that our lists need standard controls to be navigable. But as we add feature and feature to the UI, we have to be very careful of visual clutter. We wanted developers to be able to get into the flow of creation. So whenever they look at part of our UI, the first thing they should be seeing is the thing they're most likely going to need. But we can't know for sure what exactly that thing is, so in the cases where we can make the UI customizable, we should definitely try and do so. So these first concepts are half blueprint, half brainstorm. This is just a first draft that simply focused on making sure those standards were met and bringing up any new features that I thought were important. This is a really important step to get right because I was working with a team who weren't familiar with the level design workflow. Having it would let us discuss and prioritize changes as well as improve them before implementation. We'd start with proper menus at the top, and that could be a fallback for all of the functions that we didn't have available elsewhere. We'd expose the details of our object source files for easy editing and access, and take abstract things like variable arrows and give them formal controls and documentation within the tool. It was during this process that I started to discover just how much of the room editor is actually hidden from or completely forgotten by its users. We discovered an ancient feature at one point, one that not a single level designer had ever heard of. We eventually went to our terrain programmer to track it down, and it turns out that it was used once for a single quest back in the early days of Path of Exile 1's campaign. It still worked, miraculously, but we had long since replaced the functionality with newer tech. In that case, we had designed the visible UI for the replacement feature, but we kept the old feature documented just in case anybody ever came across it. So, one huge advantage that we had while making these markup images was that one of our former programmers had implemented a Python wrapper for the Dear IamGUI API. And that was designed to extend our existing UI. So essentially, that gave me a light scriptable version of the framework that I could use to rapidly prototype the new functions that I was requesting. That just have limited functionality. And this proved to be a really useful and important step between the concept drawings and the final implementation, because I could build my own prototypes, and then the more I did that, the more I could establish what worked, I could iterate, and by the time that we got done iterating on complex interfaces like the selection menu on the far right there, I could pass on my construction to the programmers, they could see exactly what I've done, and then they could throw that out and build it for real in C++. All of this meant that we could iterate very quickly on new features. So I could come up with an idea, we could try it, we could make changes, and if it turned out to be bad, then we could fix them, and we could edit into something usable within an afternoon. The development process overall was actually surprisingly rapid once it got underway. So 2 months into this year, the room editor looked like this. So we've got feature menus, we've got hotkey lists, toggle icons, tooltips, visualization modes, long-standing bugs had been fixed, long-hidden features exposed. The layer idea that I'd proposed had become a scene hierarchy. The in-game camera view became an actual in-editor preview mode you could walk around in. And because we're using a well-supported UI library, every aspect of that layout can be customized according to your needs. It can be reskinned, enlarged, whatever you want. The tool isn't just usable, it's convenient. All of the common functions are at our fingertips, and not just ours, because features like that in editor preview mode prove really useful to other departments. Animators and effects artists can now use our level design tools to see their work in context without having to boot up the game. And this is what the room editor looks like today. So after February, it was no longer in need of rapid development. We could spend the next few months on polish, we could see how the level designers used it, and we could respond to their feedback. The result was that a lot of the features that we didn't use often could be de-emphasized, and the ones that were unexpectedly popular could be re-emphasized. So things like the preview mode now have visual prominence up at the top center there. We've got a newly added quick load menu there. It makes it much easier to work on whole sets of rooms during larger projects. We improved user customizability. We added key remapping functions that we hope to further improve over time. And essentially, what do all these improvements buy us in Path of Exile 2? So PathOfXL2's tile art's a lot more dynamic. You can see an example with the walls at the far end of that arena. They have full arches while the ones near the camera don't. They're a lot shorter. This is contextual geometry hiding. It's a property that we simulate in real time as you edit the room. The hanging lanterns, the piled up chalices and things, those are more dynamic elements. We added buttons that randomize all of these randomizable features within the room every time you click it. We added a way to preview what that boss there and what the players looks like in the environment, in the exact in-game lighting that we use. Additionally, we've got new animation controls, so we can see exactly how those pillars are going to be destroyed, and we've exposed scripting functions so that I can see the exact trigger radius of the door over there. So we have the capability now to build extremely complex scenes without having to guess how they'll turn out in-game. Editing, previewing, and iterating on them is trivial, and the entire process has been ergonomically improved for ease of use across multiple departments. Overall, the Room Editor has been a standout success in terms of what active tools development can offer. We'd always worried that tools development would be a drain on our programmers' time, but we actually empowered a lot of developers surprisingly quickly. It helped a lot that Dear IamGUI is a widely used, fully featured UI solution that lets us iterate on our features during tools development quite easily, and lets us quickly incorporate changes from feedback afterwards. By soliciting suggestions and feedback from the people using the tools, we could target our development towards them, while at the same time trying to avoid interrupting their existing workflows. And that quick iteration time meant that we could take chances on experimental features that sometimes provided unexpected benefits and other times took a while to get right. So, at the same time as we're making all those changes, we also wanted to improve our layout tools, the graph editor and the tile testbed specifically. So these tools are conceptually pretty simple. For the most part, we didn't need to add that much more functionality to them, but they were both vulnerable to technology changes. That ended up being mostly fine for our tile testbeds. Our terrain programmer had been keeping it up to speed to help iterate on his own work, but it had caused all sorts of problems for the graph editor. So the graph editor, using our old UI there, was much like the room editor. Its usability varied quite a bit depending on your screen resolution, for example. I use a 2K monitor at home, so those individual elements don't increase in size based on that resolution, and it made it a real hassle to get anything done. That old UI also isn't particularly dynamic. Those text fields, for example, are as big as they're ever going to get, which means that if you fill them up with individual descriptions, for example, then it just becomes far more than can be displayed and you can't see anything. And that was before text field stops displaying the cursor position correctly, and eventually we stopped even using them. And we would just make edits in a text editor instead. The tile testbed, meanwhile, had been well maintained, but the functionality and that information summary there was kind of limited for what we were wanting. Many of the tool's controls are also added as undocumented launch options, which created a real discoverability problem. As we added more complex terrain features for leagues and as PathOfXL2 increasingly started using overlay post passes, we needed this interface to become more informative and more interactive. Now, because this was a tool that our terrain programmer was regularly using in more depth than we did, it made sense for him to spearhead most of its UI upgrades while I focus on the graph editor. So what did we want from the graph editor outside of just making it work properly? Well, the big ergonomic problem with the graph editor was that it was actually more precise than it needed to be. So a dungeon graph takes place on a room grid. Why did we need to care what point within a grid cell that node was? You can see a lot of detail in your layouts when the whole thing is stretched across the entire window, but when the UI overlays on top of it, then you start being unable to click things and stuff. So we'd long had issues actually placing nodes in our graphs in the upper left and right-hand corners just because of the old UI. And rather than use these sort of free-form text boxes for our descriptions, it made a bit more sense to have a menu of tags and values and stuff so you could see them all at once. A lot of the features could stand to be streamlined or simplified or even automated so that the designers could focus more on what they're creating and less on the physical process of creating it. So here's what we ended up with. You can see my port of the quick load menu up in the top left. It's the same one as in the room editor, along with the menu bar there that lets you customize the various elements, including the size of everything clickable. We've then got the graph properties and transformations and a full list of available edges there with color coding. So the graph itself can be zoomed and panned and now displays footprints for the rooms so we can get a better size of the area's proportions. We now also have that list of descriptions so you can see them clearly, you can add new ones from a menu. It's a lot harder to make mistakes when you're bypassing spelling errors. So this tool involved probably our most disruptive changes to our workflow, but the result was much more efficient and less error-prone. Meanwhile, that tile testbed is now rife with debugging tools. The launch options have an actual UI representing them, so we can easily test a range of mods and terrain stats on our areas. We also have a complete breakdown of every stage of terrain generation down to the microseconds of that level's construction. This lets us explore every stage of it, which is extremely important in Path of Exile 2, because the overlay tag that I mentioned replaces groups of tiles after they're already placed, so we can see before and after. All of those features come into play when you're trying to build, say, a Mad Max-style desert convoy for the player to fight across in Path of Exile 2. So technically, this is a dungeon, but it's one of the most uniquely complex dungeons we've ever built. We're operating on a tiny room grid size to give these carts granularity in terms of both their size and their position. And we then use the overlay tech to find the positions of the carts and then stamp down bridges between them rather than use our traditional sort of door systems. If those break, then the level's uncompletable. So we need to understand every single way those carts can connect. It's not the most complex level that's been proposed even, but it's certainly the most complete at this point. So what did we learn from our layout tools? Well, firstly, we learned that the whole process isn't about me. It's an advantage for me to design tools that I'm deeply involved in using, but if somebody else uses them more deeply than I do, we should defer to them. We were somewhat fortunate that the graph editor had so many issues at the time that we wanted to do the overhaul, because if we're already using text editors, then even the most disruptive change is still going to be an improvement. Likewise, with new features coming in that we don't actually manually place in levels directly, it's critical to know how the terrain generator was placing them. The terrain logger is a deluge of information to be sure, but it's easily filterable, easily searchable, and gives you a lot of useful information. It's one thing not to overwhelm your users with screen clutter, but for a highly technical job, that should be very easy to pull up the exact bits of clutter that you need. So this next one's been a challenge, and it still is. If the room editor and the graph editor are solidly owned by level design, the asset viewer is a development infrastructure hub. It's one of the most widely used tools throughout the company, whether you're working on tiles, doodads, characters, animation, materials, effects, even some game design stuff. It all goes through the asset viewer. So on the one hand, that meant that it was converted over to IMGUI very quickly, compared to the more specialized tools, I mean. But everybody who worked on it was also very nervous about breaking something that they didn't use. So some parts of the interface had been customized very heavily already, while others had been left entirely alone. And there was certainly no unified plan for the future of the tool. So for the purposes of this talk, though, we're just going to focus on the improvements we made to the part of the tool that deals with tile markup and metadata. So, you know the drill by now. The tool started as a window, it had some buttons over it, and a lot of hidden features that are bound to undocumented hotkeys. At this stage, it also had the beginning of a custom scripting system, which is still in use to this day. It's easy to see what the asset viewer does in the modern UI, though. We've started converting the menu over to the left into a combination of that top menu bar and the left panel. So spawning and selecting objects now populates the menus on the right with piles of information, toggles, editors, and the like. Just having the modern UI, unfortunately, doesn't solve every ergonomic problem, but at least means that the various functions are exposed and usable by developers. It'll get there, though. The tools for material editing, effects work, and animation have all seen significant development, iteration, and the rest are sure to follow. So, our problem in level design is that Path of Exile 2 wants 7 new story acts and dozens of new tile sets. And if we wanted to make up a tile interface, if we wanted to mark up a tile, the interface looks like this. So what you can see here are edge and ground types. The incomprehensible text with the green boxes above them are edges. They determine how the tile connects. And the rest of the incomprehensible text tells the game what kind of ground those edges separate. So you might think this is hard to read, but that's only because I've rotated it slightly on a diagonal. If I was looking at it perfectly edge on, it would be completely impossible to read. Way back at the start of the talk, I mentioned that a full tile and doodad set might have hundreds of individual assets. How many work hours do you think it might take to make metadata for all of them using this interface? And that's before we try to apply collision markup to the tile. So our game's tiles can be highly complex, and we need a combination of automatic detection for things like height and manual painting controls for things like walkability. It's essentially a type of pixel art. And when you're marking up dozens of tiles, you pretty much want all the features of an image editor. You want gradients for slopes, custom brushes, copying and pasting, as well as the ability to lock different layers of markups so that you can just stamp things down with reckless abandon. So the need for the tile tools was not just to make them usable, but to make them aggressively efficient. This metadata markup process was a huge drain on the level design team's time, and so much of it was from wrestling with the interface. So marking up a tile needed to go from taking minutes to seconds. How do you enable developers to go fast? Well, accessibility is up first. Ergonomics, rather. You take the fiddly dot interface, you blow it up into those nice tiles that you can't possibly click between. The awful red and green dots will give them size, will give them volume, make them easy targets to hit. Let's store lists of edges and ground types that you've already used, along with any that we think you might want to use. And just while we're at it, let's get the ability to copy and paste layouts, both metadata and markup layouts. So as a result, marking up tiles just works. So you can click and drag to paint, the colors are automatically generated, but they're adjustable if it picks a bad combination. We reduce as much of the visual clutter as possible unless you say you want it. You can mark up as many tiles as you like, and only the biggest, most complex ones are going to take more than a few seconds. The result is as little messing around with file paths and misclicks as possible. Because remember, we don't want our designers' mental energy spent wrangling with the interface. But things didn't always go smoothly. So the markup painting interface is complex, it's a bit messy. And worst of all, development was interrupted during our iteration process. So the programmer who was working on it had another major project that he was assigned to and had to leave it alone for a while. And so we were left with this interface, incomplete and inefficient for quite a while. Remember that our ability to affect the development infrastructure is always constrained by the realities of day-to-day development. This isn't a failing, it's just a trade-off that we had to make. We were able to get the feature up to speed eventually, but we had realized that we need to plan disruptive changes better. We need to be able to respond to disruptions in our own process. But what did we end up with what did we end up with for Path of Exile 2? Well, we ended up with a tool that could do everything short of automating the tile markup process. A robust means of churning through dozens of complex tiles, piece by piece, without having to wrestle with the interface. So we can take a task as complex as this, as complex as marking up this many tiles. We can do it a dozen times with as few clicks and misclicks as possible. We can then take advantage of the modular nature of our game, so we can break up the task of marking up walkability into chunks. So we can mark up a single wall. We can then paste the markup for that wall in every single tile that it uses it. We can mark up a slope, we can paste that in everywhere that gets used, until the new tile set is complete. That way we spend minimal time on setup, and we can focus on actually building the levels. So, despite some setbacks, our initial plans weren't all bad. Our known time sinks were absolutely opportunities for streamlining. We benefited a lot from our ability to automate the setup process for several of our tools. Rather than having to load a bunch of individual files, our developers could just take the ones we prepared earlier for them, and they could just begin working. This reinforced an idea we've been seeing throughout the project. When we made tools intuitive, when we made them easy to use, we made them customizable, our developers could optimize their own workflows far in excess of what we designed. For future asset viewer changes, one of our programmers suggested branching the major UI changes. So we'd keep them opt-in until they were actually finished so that people could see them and they could try them without disrupting their workflows. And the way we do this is just with a one-button toggle that people can turn on and off at any time. So let's take a step back. We've made quite a lot of changes to these tools, and we're genuinely making them quite complex. But how does anybody know what we've done? So we can certainly offer tooltips and hotkey lists, but we can't anticipate every issue. We can't build an entire manual into each feature every time you use it. And we're not always around to answer every question. We took a lot of different approaches to communicating changes and ensuring that the information required to use each feature is available. And I'm just going to go over a few here and the pros and cons of each. So the first method is our in-tool documentation. Every tool has a hotkey list, and most of those entries have a tooltip explaining exactly what they do. Additionally, we have tooltips over most functions, and certainly anything that's just represented with an icon. These will explain not only the function, but if that function has any hotkeys. And by the way, we found that you can really just add tooltips to whatever you want. They're basically free, and their information is needed, which is really useful. So our help menu also has a link to that tool's manual and our internal Office wiki, which I will touch on in a moment. Lastly, Path of Exile is a constantly growing game. We're always creating new objects and content for it, so we wanted to give users the ability to add comments, tags, and categories to the content that they create. So this allows our developers to communicate their own intent and function without having us necessarily be involved. So, of these techniques, tooltips ended up just being a really powerful, easy to implement way to communicate a lot of information exactly when you need it. Even in cases where they clutter the interface, we just implemented a button hold for more information. So they really lent themselves to the overall approach that we took of offering more information as you ask for it. So, for example, the surface layer might have an icon, the tooltip gives you its name and a hotkey, the help menu gives you more information, and then the manual will give you the full documentation of the feature. Any tools that require users to make their own documentation are something that you should probably go into anticipating they won't get used a lot. Some people like me are nerds who like to comment all of our work, and we like to make sure everybody knows how to use it and stuff. But even I don't comment every single thing that I do. But I only have to comment an object once, and then it's commented forever, for everybody, anytime they want to use it. So it's a low-frequency tool, but it's a high-impact one. And if I want to bring somebody new onto a project, I can just take a minute, comment up all the objects, and now everybody knows what to do. So this is the just tell people you changed something approach to telling people you changed something. Typically, when we add a new feature to something, it gets posted in the relevant channels in our internal Discord server. So just telling people that we changed something in person is a great way, and probably still the best way, to get immediate feedback and comments. But there is value in having a record of those changes as well. Those internal posts prompt the developers who see them to comment, ask questions, eventually send us feedback without us having to individually seek them out. We recently supplemented that approach with a built-in patch notes pop-up in each of our tools. That way people who miss the message on Discord can still see the changes. So each of our methods for communicating has trade-offs. We're fortunate enough that they're all relatively low effort, and they usually aren't too disruptive on our part to use. Still, having 3 communication channels is better than none. especially if they can provide avenues for feedback from the team. So different methods are useful for different kinds of features. Major changes might merit in-person discussion. Minor changes could just be a patch note. But remember that communication is how your tool's development goes from disruptive to being useful. If your users can't discover your features, you might as well not have added them. But ultimately, nothing's foolproof. So we spend a lot of time trying to design intuitive, accessible tools with discoverable features that offer our developers all the functionality they want in response to their needs. But what happens if they just forget about something? It happens, we're all busy, we're dealing with a lot of information on a daily basis. There are nuances and notes that it just doesn't make sense to put in a tooltip. And if somebody misses our change communication, they might not know to look back for it. So that's why we try to offload as much of our institutional knowledge into a central repository of documentation. So as long as people know to check it, there's always another chance for them to find a detail without having to rely on finding the right person who knows an obscure bit of game dev arcana. For much of Grinding Gear's history, our internal documentation was very decentralized. Or it wasn't so much documentation as it was knowing the name of the person who wrote the feature. A wiki solves that discoverability problem. And it's also easy to use and refer back to. So that's super important because the onboarding process for us can very often just be a huge info dump. And it's really handy to have that information written somewhere that new staff can just refer back to without having to keep coming back to us asking the same questions. It also means that if somebody who owns a feature were to leave the company, we don't suddenly have a gap in our institutional knowledge. Of course, it still requires people to update it frequently, but the results are invaluable when you do. We're constantly working with people from other departments, for example, and we're having to explain the features we're working on to them. And because we're dealing with living documentation, we can quickly build a highly detailed knowledge base, a paragraph at a time, as we work. And we need a knowledge base like that for PathofXL too. We're implementing new changes in technology on a regular basis, which are themselves kinds of tools for our developers to use. Our artists need to be familiar with our physically based rendering pipeline. They need to know how to add orientation-restricted geometry to dungeon tiles, or how we optimize long draw distances in our engine. Even developers who have been around since the early days of the company are being presented with new ways to do their jobs. And as those jobs become more complex, those of us creating the new technology need to find ways to stop the constant changes from becoming overwhelming. So we need to make sure that each member of the company is able to take advantage of as much of our evolving development infrastructure as possible. Because communication is what it all comes down to. Communication not only determines how effectively people will use our tools, but how effectively we can develop them. Communication is how we expand our development infrastructure. It lets us create new and more efficient workflows throughout the company. As we develop these tools, we don't just talk to level designers, we talk to environment artists, effects artists, game designers, and animators. All sorts of departments whose perspectives take our tools in new and interesting directions that we may never have anticipated. So here's an example. One of the most common interdisciplinary things that we do in Grinding Gear is integrating monsters with the terrain. So usually that means that the monster climbs out of a pit or emerges from a wall to attack you, for example. So we need a game designer to create a version of that monster that spawns hidden, an environment artist to create a piece of terrain for it to emerge from. We'll need animation to create the actual emerge animation, and we'll need a level designer to actually place it in the level. Often, this results in our animators having to make guesses about how the monster will spawn and how it will be positioned in relation to the final terrain. So we took that feedback and we created a preview system. So each spawn point can now show exactly what it will spawn, where it will spawn it, and play animations. This is great for level designers as well because we're often the ones who are actually doing the final alignments on the spawning monsters. This way we can make sure that both us and the animators are seeing the exact same things. It wasn't just animators who liked being able to use the room editor as an in-context preview tool instead of having to boot up the game over and over. Our effects artists were keen to take advantage of our upgrades to reduce their own iteration time. Now, the room editor doesn't have the full suite of effects tools that the asset viewer does, but we were able to give the tools ways to communicate instead. So we can take a selection of assets in the room editor, we can send them to the asset viewer in the exact positions that you place them in the room editor. The artist can make their changes, and then they can send them back to the room editor and view those changes in the appropriate lighting. So we actually have a lot of tools that can pass each other data like this, including our in-game debugging tools now. And the more we talked with people in different departments, the more we got familiar with the friction in their workflows. So remember the concerns everybody had with developing major changes in the asset viewer and stepping on each other's toes? So we weren't experts on each other's workflow, but the solution to that was that we just involved more people in the upgrades. I'd recently started to feel confident enough that I could propose some UI changes to a piece of the asset viewer that several departments used. And you can see my initial suggestions on the right. I put a lot of work into trying to create a modular display that each of us could use to turn the morass of information up there into something that suited our own needs. The response from effects was, in politer terms, why? So their problem wasn't that the display was complex. Their problem was that they were regularly working with 10 of those displays at a time in a nested mess of submenus. And no matter how elegantly I was able to offer them customization options, what we really wanted was, on the left, we wanted a nice clean scene hierarchy. Now, a feature like that suggests an overhaul of the entire way the program works, and this is where I would love to show you a modern screenshot of our new streamlined workflow in action. But I can't. Unfortunately, this project's still in development, using all the lessons we've learned from our tools upgrades so far. So here's something weird instead. The outliner you can see there is a limited functionality work in progress. It only loads certain types of objects. It can't really do anything with them once it's loaded them. It turns out that it's a major restructure to the underlying framework of the tool to create the final outliner, but that's fine, it's fine. We're treating tools development as an ongoing process now, and much of Path of Exile 2 is still incomplete, and we don't know every single challenge that we'll face as we build it. So the things we learned from our discussions with other departments allowed us to open up new pathways in our development infrastructure. By sending data directly between tools, we could instantly give us developers access to new feature sets. Usually everything we work on comes together in the game, but making playtesting a necessary part of all of the content creation can be quite inefficient. So if they can do most of our iteration and testing within the tools, we can save huge amounts of time. And because we treat the tools process as a tools development process as an ongoing part of development, we can continue to respond to new changes and feedback. The more we do that, the wider we reach, the more complex problems we'll end up solving. So that was how, for the past 9 months, we've been forging tools worthy of Wraeclast for one another. Path of Exile 2 presented us with complex challenges that meant we needed to change our development philosophy away from seeing tools development as an obligation or a distraction. Once we put the resources aside from it, we were able to make major strides with only a couple of developers being involved. Remember, in 3 months, myself and primarily one programmer had taken that room editor from being quite difficult to use to a highly functional tool. We looked at our developers' existing workflows that let us accelerate how we're already working, and then by branching out, we were able to expand our tool's functionality for more people. By taking an iterative process, we now have a pretty good idea of how much time and effort new features take and which ones we should focus on. So, over the course of the project, I ended up learning quite a lot, as you've already seen, and I also felt like the process was able to prove some hypotheses that I'd either had or that I'd been told but not really paid much attention to. For example, I was surprised when we got down to it just how quickly dedicated UI work was able to transform our tools, especially because the programmers weren't just taking my requests, they were running with them, they were improving them, and they were solving problems that I had missed during the design process. I think we'd collectively seen tools as a bit of a monolithic project that would mire us in broken tools and inefficiency for years, and that just simply wasn't the case. So instead, we'd been spending time and mental effort working around problems that could have been fixed in an afternoon, or a day, or even a week. At which point, that mental effort could go back into actually being spent on development. So when I went to find out what everybody else's mental effort was being wasted on, I ended up discovering problems I would never have known that we even had, as well as ways in which the solutions could improve life for all of us. So hopefully you all learned some things too, or at least you were inspired to take another look at how you can make your own development lives easier. I'll make all of these slides available at the end of the talk, along with my entire speaking script, so if you missed anything, it'll all be there. And in the meantime, does anybody have any questions? Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of this talk was about improving the existing tool. Does it sound like it?
It doesn't sound like it. Okay, bit of mic trouble.
Hello? Hello? Oh.
Hello.
Okay. So a lot of this talk was about improving tools that already exist, which is a fundamentally different problem to creating a tool where none exists. Do you have any advice as to the lessons that you've learned about creating brand new tools to like solve problems that you don't have a solution for yet, and where you would start now given the improvements that you've made to existing stuff?
Right, so the question was about the difference between improving existing tools and creating new tools for problems that you're just now discovering. So a lot of the changes we made to these existing tools were not just updating the UI for them, it was adding new features to them and adding new functionality to them. And a lot of that we got from just observing the workflow and trying to see where time inefficiency was created. So what was a repetitive task that we were all doing over and over again? What was a difficult problem that we were having to work around? Like, were we ever having to, try and do a bunch of mathematical conversions in our head that the tool could just do for us? So a lot of it essentially came down to trying to find the existing pathway people were trying to take and then trying to streamline that. And the process for making new tools and then improving existing ones was actually quite similar. Does that answer your question? Cool. Any more? On the back.
Hi, I noticed, I'm pretty sure it's in Unreal Engine 5, they have a UI where they display the whole viewport on the screen and then you hover over and all of the settings sort of pop out in a window. I was wondering if you ever considered that for Path of Exile, just having the viewport over the entire screen and then having the windows optionally.
Yeah.
On the
So
side.
the question is whether or not we took any inspiration from Unreal Editor 5, and I'll broaden that to any existing tools, and the answer is definitely yes. As I mentioned, I'm not formally trained in UX or UI design. I'm a level designer. So a lot of what I was doing was looking at other tools that I'd used, other tools that people were creating, and trying to find out what workflows those were implying and what workflows those were designed for. You noticed correctly that one of the room editor screenshots does have some UI that resembles part of Unreal Editor 5, and that's because a lot of the goals they had, the kind of minimalist but expand out to get more information stuff, was similar to the goals that we were shooting for. Good. Cool. And over there.
I got time for one more question.
Okay. Last question then.
You mentioned something about user-generated comments. It sounds like an incredibly powerful tool. Could you talk a little bit more about how exactly that works and like how does a person go about adding one of these comments and to what exactly?
Yeah. So the question was about user-generated comments, one of the features that I mentioned earlier, and about how that works. So this pass was, so essentially when we go to create objects within the game, usually there is a set of text files, and those have functional information, but they don't really have any comments that you can see outside of the files themselves. So there's essentially a metadata layer that the room editor reads in the form of a series of JSON files, where if you load up that object, it then matches it with a description that the user can write in. And people can then commit to their version of that file. They can merge it through the version control tool, and that way everybody else gets access to them. So the ability to comment on those things. They also have the ability to add tags to folders and things. Essentially, we were using these sort of like extra JSON layers as a way of customizing things where we didn't want to edit the files themselves directly. And that proved to be quite useful. It could very easily just read something and call a bunch of information from it. That help? Cool. In which case, I think that's all that we have time for. If you want to get in touch, you can see my email address and my Twitter handle, and I'm more than happy to keep answering any questions you may have. Otherwise, goodbye everybody, and thank you so much for being here.